20% to about 9% this week.
Hi everyone, thank you all so much for joining. We will get started in another minute. Okay, thank you all so much for joining. We are going to get started. I just want to note that if anyone has any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to message me in the chat box below, and I will collect them and ask them at the end of the session. And with that, I'm going to throw it over to Katrina Sandoval, our Education Director, to get things started.
Thank you, Courtney. So quickly before we jump into today's program, we're going to review our agenda and then we'll get started with our presenters and who we are. So who is ADL? A lot of you, I see some familiar names and faces from last session. So hopefully we're already familiar with who ADL is. We're going to review some definitions from last time. We're going to be participating in a really amazing TikTok privilege check if you've not heard of the viral platform that everyone's using these days. And we are going to talk about steps to allyship, a few questions or food for thought, and then we will have time for question and answer at the end. So the Anti-Defamation League is over 100 years old, and one of our main goals has always been to fight for change, be a champion of our values, and to shield against hate and extremism. We have a dual mission here at the ADL where we know that people, in order to fight one form of hate, we must fight all forms of hate. And we do that through all of our regional offices across the country and an office internationally. ADL believes in some pretty important things. One of those things is that bias is universal, but more importantly, that prejudice, hate, bias, all of those things are learned and therefore can be unlearned. And that's one of the many reasons why we're here today to do this type of programming. I'm going to pass this off to our first presenter, Miss Elizabeth Hunterton.
Hi, thanks, Kat, and thank you all for having me back. It's great to be here today. Today we're going to be talking about allyship, and I wanted to share with you all an experience I had where I had a really incredible ally when I needed one. And back to the story that I told last week about when I was being harassed by some white supremacists while I was with my two friends who were white. As soon as my two friends realized what was happening, they said, "Oh, we're going to say something." And I said, "No. We can't do that. That's going to put us in danger. Their friends will get here faster than ours will. We're going to get up. We're going to leave." And I thought what made my friends in that moment such powerful allies was A, they wanted to stand up for me. B, they listened when I said, "No, that's not the right way to go about it." And perhaps what is the most incredible thing that they can do now, like, yes, in that moment, they made me feel less alone, which was welcomed. But where their strength really comes in at being an ally is now, when they're in their circles with their peers who happen to be Caucasian and affluent, they're able to share that experience when they hear the language of racism isn't real, this doesn't exist, heck, we've had a Black president. My friends are now able to be representative of me and say, no, actually racism is real, and here's how I know that. And I think that component alone makes them such incredible allies, and allies that I'm truly grateful for.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andre Wade. I am the State Director for Silver State Equality. We are a statewide LGBTQ civil rights organization here in Nevada. I'm born and raised here, two-time graduate of UNLV. I've done a lot of work here in the community. I like to say that my parents are intra-American immigrants because they came from the South during the last wave of the Great Migration, just a large swath of Black Americans leaving the South because of the oppression and hatred that was going on back then in the 60s and before that. I also teach at UNLV. I teach a gender, race, class, and sexuality course. And I got an email from one of my students a couple of weeks ago when the protests really kicked off. And in part, this is what they said. So back in class, I remember that I was cynical and would oftentimes try to retort your teachings to help keep my sense of manliness and beliefs. Now in today's climate, I wish I would have listened much sooner during class and been more of that ally and advocate you strongly preached. Today, I struggle to reach out and help during this movement because I once believed wrongly. Because of your class, I am a better person and better advocate. And I really just wanted to share that because in that email, he just talked about his journey to now allyship. And I think that's what a lot of folks go through. And I think that's a lot of the information we'll cover today.
Thank you so much. Both of those stories were very impactful. So I'm Kat Sandico. I am the education director here at ADL Nevada, and I am excited to be a part of this program today for a multitude of reasons, but one of them comes from my own past experience working with high school students. There are oftentimes so many kids walking through the hallways of a high school that don't have a place to go because they feel completely left out and completely without a social circle. And that's why allyship is important to me, having seen students who didn't have someone or somewhere to go or a group to be a part of. And I truly think that all of us can be a little bit better and be a better ally to anyone, regardless of those differences. So before we really dive into today's topic, I wanted to review the definitions from last week, just so that way we're all on the same page. So this first definition is implicit bias. And that implicit bias is something that you really think about unconsciously. It can be positive or negative. Nowadays we hear implicit bias really related to a negative connotation, but it's about the members of a group merely because of their membership in that group. The next one is privilege. We're going to be talking a lot about privilege today and how we can harness and utilize that. But privilege is, the thing about it is that it's unearned and often unrecognized. So until we take a moment to reflect and see what kind of privilege we have, there's no good way to know that you have or don't have it. And of course, race. That's one of the hot topics and probably hot words in the news at all times. I think we're all pretty familiar with what that is. It is a category in which society places individuals. It's mostly a social construct at this point. There, of course, are different schools of thought on this, but again, some examples would be looking around on the screen and seeing the different races of people here today. The next one is racism, which is the marginalization or oppression of people based on a socially constructed hierarchy around racial privileges that usually leans towards white people. And you have structural or systematic racism. And this is something that we'll be talking about later as well. And it's a combination of systems and factors that advantage white people or another more privileged group for people and for people of color that causes widespread harm and disadvantages in access and opportunity. So we're going to be doing this really exciting TikTok privilege challenge. So in just a moment, I'm going to ask that everyone put up both hands. And we're going to be watching a short video. And as the woman shares her statements, you're going to put down one finger if you are able to agree with her statement. So if you get a little confused, that's all right. Don't worry about it. We're going to be showing you those statements on the next slide to reflect on this. But in the meantime, we'd love for all of you to participate. So take it away. Ian, I think we're experiencing some sound issues. Hold on one moment, folks.
Check your privilege edition. Put a finger down if you have been called a racial slur. Put a finger down if you've been followed in a store unnecessarily. Put a finger down if someone has crossed the street to avoid passing you. Put a finger down if you've had someone clench their purse in an elevator with you. Put a finger down if you've had someone step off of an elevator to keep from riding with you. Put a finger down if you've been accused of not being able to afford something expensive. Put a finger down if you have had fear in your heart when being stopped by the police. Put a finger down if you have never been given a pass on a citation that you deserved. Put a finger down if you have been stopped or detained by police for no valid reason. Put a finger down if you have been bullied solely because of your race. Put a finger down if you have been denied service solely because of the color of your skin. Put a finger down if you've ever had to teach your child how not to get killed by the police. Any fingers left? That's privilege.
Thank you, Ian. So one of the reasons why we chose to do this today is that recognizing our privilege isn't about making us feel guilty or bad or any of those things. It's about recognizing that you have power that other people might not have. And just like she said at the end of the video, if you still have fingers up, that indicates that you have some sort of privilege over someone else who does not have those things. So for those of you that maybe didn't catch all of the statements, these are the statements that we just all responded to. You know, there are people who don't have the ability to not live with these things on a regular basis, being bullied solely because of your race, or being denied service solely because of the color of your skin. You know, and I think we would all like to think that in today's day and age that that's a little bit different. But the reality is, if I just on my small portion of the screen that I could see, many of you had fingers put down, which indicates to me that there is a lot of work that still needs to be done. Elizabeth? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. You know, I think that that exercise is so powerful because I think that so often we associate privilege with socioeconomics. And as we talked about last week, you know, I come from upper middle class family, 2 white parents who adopted me. I still get racially harassed. And so really delineating that privilege, I don't inherit my white parents' privilege because I'm not white. But I've never wanted them to be ashamed of being white, and I've never wanted them to apologize to me for their skin color. I depend on them to use it because they still have fingers up and I don't. And I think that it's important to be an ally because the truth of the matter is there are people who will listen to you, but they will dismiss me. And people that will not see you as being combative or aggressive, that will accuse me of that. My skin is weaponized and it is seen as a weapon and yours isn't. So that is why we rely, and again, not asking anyone to apologize for their privilege, but we need it because we will never have that or be the beneficiary of that. So we need you to use it.
So an ally is someone who has privilege but chooses to stand for and with marginalized communities by taking tangible, ongoing actions to dismantle systems of oppression. That sounds like a lot, but it's very important because our United States of America was built on oppression and racism. And so when people say that the criminal justice system is broken, as an example, and we're always like, no, it's working exactly how it was designed to work. And that's saying a lot. And so we can oftentimes be centered on individual levels of oppression and racism, which I think is very important. But often we also have to step back and realize that there is racism in policies, there's racism in data, and there's racism in medical practices that affect marginalized communities.
And I think to piggyback on that, you know, and Andre and I were kind of talking, when it comes to racism and allyship, it really looks different for the two of us because our experiences, mine as a Black woman of mixed race and Andre's as a Black man, we have very different experiences with racism. And so that allyship looks very different. Whereas I'm subjected to structural racism all the time. When I show up at the interview and people say, "Oh, you are younger than I thought," because I understand that they didn't have an association with the name Elizabeth Hunterton. But I know what they mean when they say younger. I look different than they expected me to look. And I think that's really important that we have these conversations, because that allyship just looks very different with individuals exercising racism and hateful rhetoric versus the structural and systematic racism that affects so many as well.
And let's be clear, even as a Black gay man, I have privilege, and I still have to fight with those within my Black community who have more privilege than I do. And so with the Black Lives Matter movement, I'm going to give you some behind the curtains information right here. So with the Black Lives Matter movement, we all rally around that. However, a lot of people in the Black community point to this idea that why is it that people in the LGBTQ movement are taking up the air when it comes to Black Lives Matter. And so we are trying to fight within our own community for visibility and acceptance. And people fail to realize that Black Lives Matter was formed by 2 queer women. 2 out of 3 women are queer. And so there's this constant need for allyship outside of groups and then even within groups. And I'll end with this. As we live in a patriarchal society, we always align ourselves with men. But there's this reminder that no matter how much violence, oppression, prejudice, however, that Black men face, we still have Black women beneath them, and even more so Black trans women who often need more allyship than anyone else on this stratified ladder.
Thank you both for sharing that. So in just a second, we're going to review some steps to allyship. But before that, we're going to be launching a poll. It's anonymous, and we're going to ask that everyone take a moment to respond to this poll. And the question is how comfortable do you feel in having a conversation about race and racism? Go ahead and you can select an answer that best suits your comfort level. And again, it's anonymous, so no one will know what you selected. We'll just see a percentage as all of you start to roll in those answers. Okay, give it just a minute or 2 more. Okay. So the reason why we stopped and took a poll with this moment is that we know that this conversation can be uncomfortable. And it looks like from the poll that many of you shared that you feel very comfortable talking about race and racism. But a lot of the feedback that we got from our last webinar was that there were still a lot of questions. And how do you manage those things when there are uncomfortable conversations that come up? So in just a moment, the 3 of us will be taking you through some steps to allyship, and then also some conversation pieces, some things to keep in mind. So thank you for placing that up there, Ian. Okay, so our steps to allyship start with listening. We need to take time to listen to those around us, especially those from the Black and marginalized communities around us, hear what they're saying on the news, in our neighborhoods, and understand that it's not about you necessarily, but it's about listening and truly listening and hearing what they have to say. Take some time to educate yourself. Educating yourself is one of the most important and easy things that you can do. Pick up a book, watch a show on Netflix. Netflix and Hulu both have categories right now completely filled with movies from Black and African American actors and directors and producers. Your local bookstore, your local library has access to all of these things as well. And taking the time to learn and experience things through that perspective and that lens is one of the most important things we can do. And for me, lastly, is to get involved. You know, of course, up to your comfort level. We know that there's a pandemic still happening outside our doors right now. But if you're comfortable attending a local protest or a rally, attend that. If you are interested in learning more about civil rights groups such as the NAACP or HRC or the National Urban League, reach out to those folks into your community and see how you can get involved with them. Elizabeth?
Yeah, the steps to LH, showing up. And listen, you know, we discussed this on the last call. Like, I've been where you guys were at. I had 2 white parents, and showing up was one of the most important things I could do. Going to the events, going to churches, being there to listen and learn, showing my, you know, seeking acceptance within that group was so important to me. And the beauty of Google is it's really easy to find which businesses are Black owned and operated, and it's pretty incredible. And if you ever want to treat yourself, get some soul food. There's some amazing soul food restaurants here in town, and it's delicious, and we'll just waive calorie counts because it's delicious. Speaking up, holding those difficult conversations, this is so critical. And when a friend or family member, when you hear them saying something hateful or inappropriate, call them out. And it's not necessarily saying you're wrong, I don't want to hear you say that, but drawing a boundary for yourself and saying, I will not tolerate that kind of language around me. That way you're not trying to govern the actions of somebody else. You're simply saying what you will and will not tolerate, which is critical when having these conversations. And intervene. This is so important when you see that somebody is being targeted, because if people intervene, then you're not watching video footage of a man being killed. You're watching video footage of people preventing a man from being killed.
So as you go on this journey, things can be uncomfortable for you. Even if you are comfortable with speaking up on racism, you can find yourselves in a situation where you might feel that you are speaking out of turn, or you don't have the right words, or maybe you've done something where you're kind of maybe feeling regret. All of that is part of the process. We have to sort of welcome it into what we're doing. When you grow up Black, you see and learn everything it is to know about whiteness. But when you grow up white or not Black, you know very little about what it means to be Black. And so without having vocabulary or even just basic teachings and going back to Netflix and watching television and movies that have a strong representation, positive representation of Black people as an example, we can find ourselves not having the tools around allyship. But again, as you go on your journey and you do some self-reflection, just welcome those feelings. And as you go about, just learn from your mistakes. I am an ally of the transgender community, have been since 2008 when I started doing volunteer work with the Human Rights Campaign. And I took the time to be able to learn what it meant to be transgender, talk to people, meet people, hear their stories, and continuously learn because it's constantly changing. But even in that, sometimes I'll say the wrong things or think I've said the wrong things, or maybe I haven't explained something correctly. But if I do, I just apologize if I see it for myself or if I'm called out on it. And it's okay, because it's all about, I believe, intent. But stay engaged in the process. If you will notice on social media, people will say something like, you know, when Breonna Taylor's name is no longer trending, are you gonna care? When Black Lives Matter is no longer trending, are you gonna care? If you are in a difficult conversation or you lose some friends or family around it, because that is part of the process, unfortunately, it's really important to stay engaged with the overall goal in mind. So just hang in there. And my favorite bullet point, having worked in nonprofits and leading nonprofits, but just being what I consider myself to be a micro philanthropist. I give small amounts to many organizations, or I just give a small amount because that's all that I have, and I'm perfectly okay with that. But I really embrace micro philanthropy because what's needed for these civil rights organizations like ADL, is your contributions to continue the work to have important programming and services like this. And so please, as much as you can, donate, continue to donate, encourage your friends to donate, because your support will help fuel change in America.
Thank you both so much for going through those with us. Before we move on to this next section, I just wanted to ask both of you, Elizabeth and Andre, is there anything on that list that you feel like we could have added? Is there a way that for you, you want people to be a better ally for you, your family, your community, your children?
I think the number one thing is how we teach our children. I think that, you know, because kids see color, kids see differences. And I know my sons and I, we watch, there's a YouTube video called My Friend Martin, and it's about the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we watch it and my sons go, Mommy, I'm so proud that he fought so hard so we can have our family that looks like us, and I can have friends of different colors. And those lessons are important. And then a movie like Zootopia, which puts prejudice and bigotry and racism and assumptions and the danger in those in animal form that kids can understand and digest. And kids understand that it's not right that others dislike Nick Wilde simply because he's a fox. And then that turns into a more sophisticated conversation about racism. So I think one of the most critical things about allyship is teaching our kids to be the helpers and helping to ensure that when they see somebody on the receiving end of hate or discrimination or racism or somebody being unkind to somebody simply because they're different, it's our children's job to be helpers. It's not necessarily for them to attack the person who's being unkind, but to be there as an ally for the person who is on the receiving end of that. My sons know it's their job to make it easier for that person. And so I think that's a critical thing that might be missing.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Elizabeth. And I'll piggyback on some of that. With being an ally, it's about standing behind or next to the person or the group in which you're being an ally for. So you don't want to step up in front of folks and take over the conversation. And so that's something I think to be mindful of. But I think education is really important. It's a lifelong journey. There are many books to read, and as we mentioned again, movies and documentaries to watch. And I think what you'll find is that there's a lot about Black people in America, as an example, that you have not learned in school and you don't know about, which is just central to American history. I think there's a big awakening that comes with that. But as you have that awakening, you grow in your allyship, I think that foundation will give you the ability to really charge forward with confidence.
Thank you both. So I'm going to pass this back to Elizabeth to lead us in our conversation about conversation strategies.
So, you know, in high school, I went to school with a lot of white supremacists, and I had an assigned seat across from one of them. And all of these steps are what I learned in communicating with him. And again, this was a man who had swastikas burned into his hands and wore a white power jacket. And I wanted to understand his perspective. And so here are the lessons that I learned from him. And what I learned with this strategy is that it can work with somebody who literally hates you. And the beautiful thing about it is that in our common everyday life, we're not dealing with people who hate us. So this is what I have found to be successful. I believe to heal the rift, that when one person speaks and shares their experience, the other person hears. And when that happens, both have the ability to change the world. The first step is have a dialogue, not debate. Don't make anyone defend their personal experience. And that's one thing, especially with racism, because it's so personal and it's so specific and individualized simply because of the color of my skin. Of course, my parents or my friends who are white may not experience racism. That doesn't make it not true. And so I think having a dialogue is so important. and not saying, well, do you mean this? Are you sure you don't mean this? And negating and negotiating, because having that dialogue and rather than a debate, it's not necessarily to make you more comfortable. It's to hear what it is that they're sharing. Establishing common ground. You don't have to have everything in common with somebody to have something in common. And when I was talking to the white supremacist, we found common ground, and it turned out he joined white power for very similar reasons to why I ran track. And we built upon that, and we built a friendship, and he became a friend and a protector from the inside, which was so critical. But it had to start with that common ground. We all have something in common. Ask clarifying questions. Again, not saying somebody is wrong and not asking them to defend their position, but to clarify and say, when you're saying you're experiencing racism in small towns, are you, because we had an interaction the other day, and my friend was saying, I said, if you guys want to experience racism, I can take you somewhere. And my friend said, I'm sorry, I need to clarify. Are you saying you can predict where you'll find racism? And I was like, yeah, I've been brown long enough to know exactly where to go to find it. If you really want to experience it, I'll take you. And so just those clarifying questions, because yes, we have a very different perspective because we have lived this life through different skins. Respect, reflect, relate. These conversations are heavy. Allowing time to privately process and draw the parallels within your own life. I think that this is so important because so often we hear something, we're having conversation, and we want to respond immediately. Sometimes it's sensory overload, and you just need to take that time, retreat, and process, and just make sure, like, okay, I hear what they're saying with this, and then working hard to understand that even if it hasn't happened to you, on some level, I'm sure you can relate and draw a parallel to a similar experience that you've had or something that you've heard of. And again, not using that in that discussion saying, oh, I know, I remember when somebody called me fat and it just hurt my feelings. Like, that's not the same thing. But when you can draw those parallels, it increases the empathy and the compassion. So I think that that's a critical step. And then the most powerful thing that people that have a different skin color than I do have is that you get to share our perspective. And this is so important because, again, like I said earlier, people can dismiss me and will dismiss me, but they might listen to you, and you will always have invitations to tables I'm just not invited to. And it's important that you share this perspective and you become our advocate, because the truth is we may never get in that room. So I think to heal the rift and having these uncomfortable conversations and building bridges between difficult places, it all starts from a place of understanding and compassion and having conversations that aren't based on right and wrong and having a debate, but really just hearing and empathizing with somebody's experience.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So we're going to cover, ADL has some simple strategies. So the first one is to assume good intent and explain the impact. Saying something like, I know that you mean well, but it hurts when you say that. You can always ask a question, just like Elizabeth said, ask a clarifying question. What do you mean by that? Or asking a question along the lines of, do you know what that word means? Especially with younger children, they might hear things on social media, on YouTube, on Twitch gaming channels, and they're repeating things that they don't understand the power or impact behind. Interrupt and redirect. Just like Elizabeth had mentioned, setting those boundaries for yourself. Let's not go there. I don't want to hear those kinds of words around myself. We want to ask people to broaden it to universal human behavior. I think that might apply to everyone. Asking if you're talking about someone individually speaking, if it's someone in particular. And then my personal favorite, to say ouch. Just like when we stub our toe or hit our funny bone, it hurts, and our feelings get hurt similarly. It's okay to tell people that your feelings have been hurt by a conversation, because it allows you to recognize and honor that moment and then continue on with that conversation. So before we jump into questions and answers, I'm going to ask folks to share their thoughts in the chat. So our first question is, what is at least one thing that you feel you can do to help be a better ally? Go ahead and throw some of those responses into the chat. Jordan, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Listen more than I speak. Practicing empathy. Listen more and learn more from others and others' experiences. Absolutely. We have our second question up there as well. How will you commit to being an ally to marginalized communities and people? Oh, these are all wonderful. Lead by example. Wonderful. Stay engaged, show up, be more involved. Speak up more when I witness racism. That's definitely a hard one, but it is impactful. Micro donations. Oh, I love that, Misty. That's great.
And pass the mic. I love that one.
Yes. Yes.
Awesome.
Speak up, intervene. Oh, these are wonderful. And then our last question on this food for thought is, what is one question you have about being an ally? So this is to kind of help you get started for a question and answer portion. So if you want to start throwing those questions in the chat box, in just a moment, Courtney is going to start sharing those questions.
Hi everyone, I just want to first thank our presenters. You guys did an amazing job and it's just really informative and helpful. I have a few questions to get us started, and then if anyone has any more questions, please put them in the chat. So my first question, and something that I think we hear a lot, is what do we say to people who are white, who have had a rough life and do not believe that they are privileged? So thus they don't believe in white privilege. What do you say to that?
The one thing I always say is that white privilege doesn't mean that you haven't struggled or haven't suffered. My mom struggled and suffered, but none of those struggles and sufferings were solely based on the color of her skin. That's white privilege. It doesn't mean that you haven't struggled. It just means that your skin color hasn't created a unique set of struggles solely because of the color of your skin.
There is a checklist by Peggy McIntosh that goes over privilege, white privilege, heterosexual privilege. There's even a Black men's privilege checklist that was created by someone else years ago. And what you do is you answer a bunch of questions, and at the end you sort of realize where your actual privilege lies. It's one of the things that was done was to have poor white people believe that even though that they're poor and don't have a lot of advantages in life for a myriad of reasons, that they should be okay with that because at least they're not Black. And so as a result, people have sort of been okay with how our socioeconomic system has been built, with this understanding that, you know, with the American dream, one day you'll be that millionaire. So let's not change anything about any of these tax structures and stuff like that. And so for too long, poor white people have seen themselves just better than any Black person ever, because at the end of the day, they're not Black and they don't have to deal with that. But when we come to allyship, it's easy for folks to say, well, hey, I've had it just as hard. But to Elizabeth's point, having it hard that's not related to your skin color or your race is a completely different world that I don't even think we can intellectualize unless you've felt, and if you haven't felt it. And so it's just something that we have to step back and really just have a better understanding of what privilege is.
Absolutely. And just to, there's a few folks in the chat that had mentioned the Invisible Knapsack article. That will be going out in the follow-up email. So we'll include a link to that. It is definitely a powerful article, and it has been updated since its original writing, I think in the 80s. So there's lots of good stuff on there.
Great, lots of great questions coming into the chat, so keep sharing them. One question we got is, what is the difference between colorism versus racism? Elizabeth, you're shaking your head, so we'll toss it over to you first.
I get it on both sides. I mean, so the colorism, that really goes back to, I mean, if you look at the very origin of it here in this country, it goes back to whether you were a field Negro working in the field as a slave, or if you were a house Negro, which tended to be the lighter skinned people, the slaves that would work in the house, usually birthing children from being raped by masters. And so there's this division within the Black culture, whether if you are light skinned, if you have long hair, if any number of things. And as Black Lives Matter happens, yes, I get it all the time. Well, aren't you only half Black? Maybe you should back aside and let real Black people have this discussion. You know what? White supremacists have never asked me for my 23andMe results. I've always been Black enough to be the subject of racial harassment. So if I'm Black enough to be harassed by white supremacists, then I'm Black enough to stand on this line with Black Lives Matter. So it's just that color. It goes back to light skin, long hair, and that happens within each race. Kind of has that hierarchy within itself. It's the same for Indian, Indigenous African, even Hispanic. You know, that is just kind of an ingrained. The fairer skinned you are, the more elite, the more wealthy, the more educated, the better you are in terms of that race. Whereas racism is on the other side of that spectrum, is saying, you're Black enough for me to hate you, I hate you. So I don't think within the Black community, it's not hate. It's just a misperceived hierarchy, I guess is the best way I can describe it. But it's not hate associated with it, if that makes sense. So I don't associate hate with colorism, I associate hate with racism. Andre, do you agree with that?
No, I definitely agree. And it's really a huge issue. We're taking that curtain, you know, we're opening up the curtain again into what goes on in our community. And so one of my brothers was light skinned, looks more like Elizabeth than he looks like me. Light skin, curly hair, and would always point out that Prince song where they talk about your straight hair ain't got no curl. Well, my straight hair didn't have any curls at all. But then there's at least a snippet of a movie I'll point you to. You can probably find it on YouTube. So Spike Lee had a film years ago called School Days. And there is a musical section in it where these women are dancing in a hair salon. And it's dark-skinned women with short hair and light-skinned women with long hair. And they talk about good and bad hair. And it's this 3-minute song and dance that's iconic and within the Black community. So I would go to YouTube, look up School Days, good and bad hair. I'm sure it's probably just the snippet of it. And you would just get a sense of the conversations that happen within our community, which is just unfortunate because it just has to do with skin color and privilege, like Elizabeth mentioned.
But for the record, I am just over colorism. I'm over the whole argument. Like, it's just, again, if I'm Black enough to be heckled by white supremacists, I'm Black enough to be Black. That's just my rule.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. Another question is, how do you start a conversation with a person of color who you don't know, but you want to support?
I think you just ask.
Yeah.
Personally, I mean, and listen, not everybody is going to want to engage in that conversation. And you'll see posts, you know, on social media where people say it's not Black people's job to educate you. Find me on social media. If you have questions, ask me. I mean, that's an open invitation. I do embrace my responsibility and my willingness to educate if I can. And even after last week's call, somebody sent me a text message. Who's a friend of mine that was on the call, and she said, you know, is this offensive? I want to write to the creator of this game. And we ended up having a conversation about that. So I think you just ask, and again, you're going to get shot down by some people, but you can just Facebook yourself right over to me and I'll answer you.
Yeah, me too. Like, I'm happy to have those conversations. I mean, just like there's some people that use the word queer and some people don't. Some people use the word African-American versus Black. You just have to see what that individual person says and think when you approach them. Yeah, but I used to tell people, well, I'd rather white people come to me and ask me for feedback or questions, because I don't want them to think that putting on blackface is going to be a way to, like, you know, show solidarity. And then next you know, I find out that on YouTube, I guess there's these makeup influencers that were
I saw that.
blackface, doing blackface to try to show solidarity. It's like, no, 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 no. And so sometimes you just gotta talk to people first.
But I think to answer your question more directly is just walking up to somebody and saying, I want to have a better understanding. Would you be willing to engage in conversation with me?
Yeah.
I think it's just the best way to.
Yeah, and I think what you said too about knowing sometimes the people that you may ask may not want to share, may not feel like that's their role. And sometimes it's a matter of asking multiple people to make sure that you get some sort of understanding. So one really great question that came in is an ally welcome at a march or a protest? And they want to support, but also want to give space. So what does that look like about making sure that you leave space, but you also use your allyship?
Yeah, I think it's important to have allies there. What these protests and riots of 2020 are different from what happened in 1968 after Martin Luther King was assassinated, was that in 1968, it was predominantly Black people protesting and rioting in uproar. Things eventually changed because of the riots for other reasons. But in 2020, you see a lot more white, brown, Asian, LGBTQ folks. And we had never seen something like that before, and it's been welcomed. However, I will say this, which is unfortunate. Then you have people who are saying like, wow, there's all these white people at this Black Lives Matter protest, where the Black people at, or something like that. And it's just like, come on, we need allies to push this movement. We need the people with privilege to push this movement. So allyship is important at protests. Show up, act out, wear a mask, only go out if you need to, and there you go.
And I think at these protests, it's important, or whether it's a protest event or anything, if you haven't been on the receiving end of racism, I don't think you get to be angrier about racism than those who have. And I think that's important, because when you see these videos of people just screaming at cops and all of that, when you look at the pictures, it's usually not Black people, because Black people, we're still too afraid to do that. Like, that's just not something we do. And so when you see a lot of these videos, it's a lot of times it's, and not all the time, I don't mean to make a blanket statement, but a lot of times it's, when the pictures I'm seeing are white people, instigating with cops, and that doesn't help us. So again, going out, being appropriate, being an ally, but not causing harm, being there to help, I think is important.
I could not agree more with either of your statements.
Yeah. Kat, I'm going to send this question to you first. How can we move past any fear we may feel in doing allyship and not wanting to say anything wrong?
That's a tough one, right? Getting over that fear is a difficult challenge. I think one of the easiest ways to start is to practice with yourself, practice within your friend group, practice having those conversations with people that you already are close and comfortable with, and then start to slowly branch out. But again, you've also all made 2 new friends here today with Elizabeth and Andre, who've graciously offered to provide insight and answer questions and things like that. But continuing to build those relationships. One of the things that I always tell families is, expose your children to things that are different than what you have around you. Go to different cultural events when it's safe outside. Go to, watch different films, watch different television shows, and really take part in different experiences. And that helps to kind of remove some of that fear or concern. Andre and Elizabeth, I'd love to hear what you two feel like a way to help remove some of that fear would be as well.
I think you just have to do it. I shared this story last week in middle school when a bunch of Black girls were trying to jump me. And I asked them, I was like, why do you want to jump me? I finally got tired of running. And they're like, well, you think you're white. And I was like, I'm the only Black person I've ever met. I'm so painfully aware that I'm Black, but I don't have anyone to teach me what that means. Like, this was before Google and encyclopedias didn't cover the cultural experience. So So I started asking every question you could think of. Like, what do we put in our hair? How do we dance? How do we say that? Where do we go? How do we go to church? And I would ask all of these questions. And yeah, I was scared because this all started because they wanted to beat me up. But I also wanted to learn. And I knew that I was going to have to push through that fear and that discomfort, because to me, it was worth knowing, because I knew they were the only people who could teach me. And pressing through that and just knowing that it was worth it, I think you just have to do it.
Yeah, it's a great question. And a lot of people feel that way. There are sort of stages to being an ally, and one of them is sort of just being silent, being afraid, but wanting to do something. And so as one gets more experience, educates themselves a little bit more, they feel a little bit more empowered and kind of go to the next phase of saying something occasionally, and then maybe attending that rally and speaking up a little bit more. And so just recognize that there are stages, but I believe that if you have the desire to be an ally, that eventually you'll find yourself in your own time, going to that next stage. And so just give yourself that ability to know where you're at, and give yourself some grace with that. And I really appreciate you asking.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this. Sorry, Courtney.
Oh, no, I was just gonna acknowledge some of the comments that are in the chat just around white privilege and really just understanding the importance of the definition. And I think making sure that you become educated and then you become an ally, being able to go out and have those conversations. And it's nice to see people, whether it's talking to your husband who was defensive about white privilege and just explaining what it is. Those are really those initial steps of being an ally, and may not seem impactful on a grander scale, but they do make an impact. And I just wanted to point that out because I think that that's so important, and the education piece really is important. Somebody also mentioned that they were reading the book White Fragility. Again, continuing those education pieces. We as an ADL staff are actually going to be doing a book club with that book to make sure that we are also reading and also continuing that education piece, which I think is just so important. So our next question that somebody had is, how does socioeconomic status nurture implicit bias, and can racial harmony ever occur with the wealth disparity that exists in America? So that's like a really loaded question. So I'll read it again so you guys can have a second to digest. So how does socioeconomic status nurture implicit bias, and can racial harmony ever occur with the wealth disparity that exists in America?
Listen, I had a real wake-up call on, and sorry, I might get emotional because this moment hurt me so deeply. It was on day 2 after George Floyd had been murdered, and there was this amazing video. And I don't watch the videos. It's not good for me. It's not good for my space. So I don't watch videos. And my friend sent me a video, and I was like, I don't watch this. And she said, just watch it. And I watched it, and it was this amazing video of hundreds of Black men standing in front of a store saying, you will not get in. And this was on day 2. You will not get in. You will not destroy this property. You will not loot here. You will not riot. And I was moved to tears. And then the woman filming it started speaking, and I started crying because I knew that no one would listen to her simply because of the way she was speaking. And because of a socioeconomic upbringing that she couldn't control, she spoke a certain way. And I knew that because of her tone and how she was speaking, that video would not go viral. Whereas if Andre and I were out there recording, it probably would. And that hurt me so deeply, but also made me realize how important it is for me to now go to my audiences and say, we cannot dismiss somebody because they speak differently than we do. We can't do it, because that video has changed my life, and I would disregard it if it was simply audio. And so I think that is so critical, that we acknowledge that we have those own implicit biases based on socioeconomics. And I do believe that racial harmony can occur within the wealth disparity that exists, because I think what we're going to start seeing, whether it's through culture, music, clothing, retail, any number of things, you have Black millionaires and Black people of wealth who are making it more acceptable that people speak a certain way. That you can have people from different socioeconomic brackets that are now touted as celebrities or super athletes or whatever it is, that I think bridges that gap. So while like nothing, like everything else, I don't think anything as far as racism is ever going to be completely abolished, just as I don't think that true racial harmony may exist with that wealth disparity, but we can improve it. And there's immense hope in that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yep, great. So another question. So if anyone, I will just say we have a few more minutes. So if anyone has any last minute burning questions, make sure that you put them in the chat. My question is in being an ally, there's so many different aspects that kind of roll into this political sphere. So whether it's bills being addressed in Congress, whether it's different political moves of how to address racism or structural racism, how do you go about navigating being an ally for Black lives, but maybe not necessarily agreeing politically with some of those points? If that
it makes sense. I'd be curious to what political points folks don't agree with that's related to Black lives.
Maybe defunding the police is something that we have seen. And I think some of it is partly just the talking points of it, but yeah. How do you navigate some of that?
I think, and not that you have to agree with everything from Black Lives Matter to be supportive, just as an example, but when we take something like defund the police, there are a lot of different definitions and it means different things to different people. So we have to figure out, we have to be on the same page. We have to have the same definition. But if you do more reading around and learning around defunding the police, you realize that it's not necessarily about, okay, go from $1 billion budget to a $0 budget, but it's taken money that would go to police force for things that other entities should be doing. So do we need law enforcement to show up to someone's home if they're truant? Do we need law enforcement to respond to minor domestic violence incidents? You know, all these sort of things where you might think, oh, a social worker could be here, or this is more of a mental health issue. So when you start realizing that that's sort of what they're getting at, I think people can have a better understanding of what those political points are. And then lastly, I'll just say, even though the question isn't directly tied to defund the police, so we're just using this as an example, that policing was born out of the end of slavery and still trying to keep Black people criminalized. And so there were these small groups that were used to arrest Black people and put them in jail, fine them, or have them be used as workers to build up like South Carolina. And so there's like this huge racial tension between policing and Black people that's just historical. And so when something like that is brought to the table, it's just really, I think, important to dig down into like where it's all coming from, because a lot of the things that are being asked for, you know, defunding the police aside, really isn't that radical. But because we are ingrained to believe that Black people are less than, not valuable, uneducated, unable, victims, and all these things, when there's certain conversations, all these biases start to crop up, and we're just like, I don't know, I feel uncomfortable because what I believe about Black people, it just doesn't match. And so when we even see like data that comes out like COVID, where you have Black people being the most affected, or the most Black children in foster care, most children in foster care are Black. When we're just okay with that data and think that that's just the natural order of things, I think we have to step back and realize that there's something else going on, which can then, I think, translate into like what are some of these policy positions in place that on their face may seem radical or unheard of, but it's really speaking to this larger, deeper, ingrained structural issue that we're all trying to untangle.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of, for people who want to be allies to Black Lives and want to make change, I think that there are a lot of struggles with the different issues and the different policy pieces of how to accomplish that, of how to get to equality. And I know that there's a lot of people that have spoken out about having issues specifically with the Black Lives Matter movement. Even though that you do believe that Black Lives Matter. I know that there's a lot of conversations about capital versus not capital. And Elizabeth, I don't know if maybe you can speak a little bit to that.
I was responding to a question. As far as like the wealth inequality,
Just the difference between maybe some of the policy pieces that Black Lives Matter have come out with as, you know, an organization versus believing that Black lives do matter. And so the movement versus what it stands for, maybe you can speak to a little bit.
you know, and I think this is the importance of wording, right? Like much like defund the police and Black Lives Matter, I think so much gets lost in translation. And I think especially when you preface anything with Black, we're going to immediately cause a divide. I think from the conversations I'm having with Black leaders in the Black community is they are working very hard to have a concrete answer for when policymakers come to them and say, okay, Black Lives Matter, what do you want? And I think that's a critical piece, and it's what's halted and basically ruled moot a lot of these previous movements that, you know, whether it's Wall Street or even Me Too, which I hate to say because I'm also impacted by that. But when people come to you and say, okay, you have our attention, what do you want? And there's not an answer that is achievable, realistic, and clear and concise, the movement gets lost. And so from what I'm hearing, the Black community is rallying with its leaders and listen, I don't think that those policies and procedures can be created from the outside without counsel from the inside. I cannot, even me as a woman of color, I cannot begin to hypothesize on what the inner city Black community needs. That's not my experience. I need to go to the Black inner city community. I need to go to that population. I need to go to those who are oppressed by police officers. As a Black woman, I usually am not. So I would follow the lead of my Black male leaders who are saying this is a problem and this is how I feel we should address it. So I think that that's an important conversation, but those answers have to come from within, and then have the baton hand off to those that can actually create the policies, procedures, and the reform that's necessary to address them. If that makes sense. So I think sometimes we get caught up on the wording when we really have to look at the intent of the movement. And unfortunately, with the wealth of information that is out there, I think that we have to seek multiple sources to get a very comprehensive answer. And we have to do that with almost anything that's in the news now. And what we're seeing with the Black community now is it's saying it's not only police officers, it's school, it's home, it's families, it's church. And there's so many layers to what needs to be created in order to meet the needs of that community. But again, that has to come from within that community, not from those of us on the outside looking in.
Great. And, you know, what I heard you say is just continuing to understand as an ally to really do that education piece and dive deeper into the nuances of some of these terms, because it's more than just defund the police, or it's more than just Black Lives Matter. There's a lot more to it, and just really taking the time to understand before speaking out. But I think you're absolutely right in the nuances of different communities as well. So thank you both so much for your time and for answering these questions. I want to be respectful of everyone's time since it's 1:07. So I just want to thank you all so much. I'm sure that you guys will stay on for another minute if people have any other questions. But I just want to flag that our next session is going to be on July 10th at 10 p.m. Please register. It's going to be all about advocacy and action. So it's really the next step into what we do on the ground. So thank you so much. Thank you to our presenters. There's a lot of good feedback on here. And it's just really nice to continue the learning process with both of you, with all of you. Thank you. I'll pass it back to Kat.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Elizabeth and Andre, for being a part of this today. I'm happy to stand for a few more minutes if folks have questions. Again, feel free to put that in the chat, and we will go from there. So if anyone else has anything else, any other questions, please let us know.
Right.
I think we got all of the questions this time, Elizabeth.
Looks like we get to get this weekend started.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you, everyone. We'll be sending out this recording on Monday, along with some resources and other items for you. So you can feel free to share this with family, friends, your neighbor who maybe you like or don't like, and you want to give them something to think about for the next week. And then we will also be sending out a follow-up survey and a registration link for our upcoming webinar on Friday, July 10th, after the 4th of July holiday. So thank you again, everyone, and enjoy your weekend.